My name is Pavan Gupta. I'm a technical marketing engineer as part of a security policy and access group. And here is what the agenda. I simplified it, but we have a packed agenda basically. So we're going to get started with an introduction of what exactly the TC-NAC service is and what are the partners that we can integrate with and how it works in case-to-case study before even we talk about individual TC-NAC vendor integration and the respective demos. Now let's get started with an introduction. We have we have different kinds of industries, enterprise networks, different industries, and so on and so forth. Each one has their own set of rules, guidelines, you might call them as checklists or policies or set of rules or regulations or even specifications. Basically, the compliance is nothing but adhering or conforming to those set of guidelines or rules or specifications or policies is what we call as compliance. When I come to my organization, probably they might have to actually scan me before even let me into my organization. That's one of the rules. So such kind of actually adhering to those rules and guidelines is what we call it as compliance. And why are we talking about that compliance basically now? What are the compliance services offered from a Cisco ISE? Before even we talk about the compliance services offered from Cisco ISE, let's first understand the licensing. You might be aware of the 3.x licensing model, Premier, Advantage, and Essential, where the Premier is the higher tier license, which offers the posture, MDM, and Threat-Centric NAC service. Basically, these are the features associated to each tier of licenses. The posture, MDM, and Threat-Centric NAC service is part of your Premier license, which offers the compliance services from an ISE. It means if you have a Premier license, you're going to get these three features. And if you're looking for what exactly the posture is, what exactly the MDM is, we did already a couple of webinars earlier, and you might have to actually take the earlier webinar videos for posture and MDM services. Now let's understand the Threat-Centric NAC service from an ISE. We're going to talk about what exactly the Threat-Centric NAC service to get started with. It's basically dynamically authorizing the endpoints or users and devices coming onto the network based on the threat and vulnerability received from these Threat-Centric NAC vendors is what the Threat-Centric NAC service offers from an ISE standpoint. Now, what are the partners that we can the ISE, Cisco ISE can integrate with? Cisco ISE can integrate with different Threat-Centric NAC vendors, and these Threat-Centric NAC vendors can be divided into two parts or two categories. One is vulnerability management systems such as Tenable, Qualys, and Rapid7. So Cisco ISE can talk to these vulnerability management Threat-Centric NAC vendors, which is going to give us information in terms of a CVSS score. CVSS refers to Common Vulnerabilities Scoring Systems. It's basically, if at all there is a vulnerability associated with an endpoint, that vulnerability can be assessed with this score. And based on the score, whether it is lower, medium, high, or critical, you can take the action or you can give the authorization to the endpoints coming onto the network. So these vulnerability management systems are going to give us the vulnerability information in terms of a CVSS score. And the second category that we could integrate with is Cisco Secure Endpoint and Cognitive Threat Analytics, which gives the information or a threat information in terms of whether it is insignificant the threat severity. Is it an insignificant, distracting, painful, damaging, catastrophic? That's how the threat severity, based on the threat severity, these categories, you can basically give the authorization. I just wanted to let you know the cognitive threat analytics is no longer exist. So you might have to just remove it. We don't consider anymore the cognitive threat analytics. Now, like I said earlier, the vulnerability management systems, Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, gives the information in terms of a CVSS score. And this CVSS score is going to be actually, again, divided into base CVSS and the temporal CVSS. So these vulnerability management systems are going to give the CVSS score a base or a temporal score. What is base and temporal? Base means over a period of time, it's not going to get changed. Whereas the temporal is, today, the vulnerability might be having so-and-so score, or it might be changing over a period of time. So the base CVSS score might not change over a period of time until and unless you address it. The temporal CVSS score is going to change periodically. So you might have to write the policies based on your compliance rules. You can write the policies based on the base CVSS score or the temporal CVSS score. When these threat management systems gives us the information in the threat severity, you can write the policies based on that threat severity. If at all it is damaging or a catastrophic, probably you might have to actually take a course of action equal to eradication. If at all it is painful or a distracting, you might have to actually take a course of action, write the policies based on course of action equal to internal blocking. If at all it is insignificant, probably you might have to actually take or write the policies based on the course of action equal to monitoring. So you can write the policies based on these attributes. You might be wondering what are those attributes and all. This is for your reference. When you write the policies, you're going to see all these threat and vulnerability information as part of a Cisco ISE dictionary called threat. Be it your threat or a vulnerability, in Cisco ISE dictionary, we call it as threat. And under that threat dictionary, we have different attributes. CTA course of action, which talks about eradication, internal blocking, monitoring. The threat Qualys CVSS score, base score or a temporal score, Tenable base score or a temporal score, Nexpose base score, etc. So you can write the policies based on these dictionary attribute names and values. Now let's understand how it works at a high level. When these endpoints and devices coming onto the network over wired, wireless, or a VPN medium, even 5G, Cisco ISE is going to ask or submits the request to these vulnerability management systems to scan the endpoints. If at all the vulnerability is found, that vulnerability information is going to be sent back to the ISE. Of course, it's a polling mechanism from an ISE. It's not actually post mechanism from an vulnerability systems. But basically, the vulnerability information is going to be updated in the ISE by polling method. Based on that vulnerability information, based on the policies that you wrote, you can give differentiated access. And coming to the threat management systems, when the same endpoints coming onto the network via wired, wireless, VPN, 5G, the Cisco Secure Endpoint detects threat, maliciousness, vulnerability, or even IOC, compromise attacks, etc. And that threat severity or the threat information or an incident information is going to be sent back to the ISE. Once the ISE updates the endpoint information, based on the policies, you can give the differentiated access based on the threat severity. Now let's see how it works, a case to case. The case-to-case study is to talk about how these endpoints come into the network initially when they periodically come onto the network. That's how we're going to talk case-to-case. Now, when these endpoints come onto the network, ISE, first of all, looks at the CVSS information. So you might be writing the policies based on the CVSS information. Is it greater than 5 or is it less than 5? Is it less than 2? So on and so forth. If it doesn't have that CVSS information, what it can do is it can submit the scan request as part of your authorization profile. It can submit the scan request to these vulnerability management systems such as Rapid7, Tenable, Qualys. Under the authorization profile, of course, you can, I'm going to actually demonstrate it. So under the authorization profile, there is a under common task, you have the assess vulnerabilities. You can select the adapter instance with which actually you wanted to assess the vulnerabilities with. Now, these Rapid7, Tenable Security Center, and Qualys managements ask local scanner to scan the endpoint and gets that information. The ISE is going to get updated with the vulnerability information based temporal CVSS score. And based on the policies that you wrote, this base temporal CVSS score is going to be stored in the ISE, this last scan result, with the timestamp. Once it is stored, based on that policies that you wrote, you can give deny, restricted access, full network access, so on and so forth. Now, let's look at the second case. When these endpoints again connect to the network, or these endpoints come onto the network again, probably they are showing up second day, or they might be re-authenticating, or you might have joining from one to another room to another room. You might be roaming from one room to another room, so on and so forth. In whatever case, when these same endpoints connecting to the network again, what happens? That's the case too. ISE doesn't have to actually submit the scan result because the scan result is available with them. Because the scan result is available with it, the Cisco ISE can straight away give the authorization as per the policies that you have defined. So just to let you know, these are the policies that I have created based on the Qualys CVSS score. If you look at the last policy, when you don't have a CVSS information, when the user or a device is part of that group, I'm making use of a Qualys scan authorization profile where I wanted to assess the vulnerabilities using the Qualys adapter. If the Qualys base score is less than 5, then I wanted to give the full network access and give the trusted devices as an SDT. As long as it is the CVSS score is greater than or equal to 5, I wanted to give the restricted access and untrusted devices SDT. If it is greater than 9, I wanted to give the deny access and the untrusted devices SDT. That's how you can write the policies based on these policies based on the CVSS information that was already available in the ISE given by these TC-NAC vendors. It's going to give the authorization straight away. Let's look at the third case where the endpoint is connecting to the network, but the scan result is beyond X hours that you have. You might be noticing that 48 hours, that's the default configuration. So let's say the endpoint is scanned. Within that 48 hours, no matter how many times the endpoint shows up, that CVSS information present in the ISE, that is what being honored by the ISE when it was giving the authorization. Now, the third case is, what if the endpoint is actually showing up in the network beyond that scan result greater than 48 hours? That's what the case 3 is. Now, it looks at the CVSS score. Oh, the endpoint information present is beyond the 48 hours. Let's ask a Rapid7 and Tenable or a Qualys to assess the vulnerabilities again. That's when it submits the scan request to these vulnerability management system to again assess the vulnerabilities of these endpoints, scans the endpoint, gets that information, update the CVSS score with the new timestamp, and gives the authorization. Let's look at the fourth case where you might want to actually periodically assess the vulnerabilities of the endpoints again and again. That 48 hours is the same timestamp that we can make use to periodically reassess the policy. The 48 hours can be configurable, of course. So how it works, when they say with those endpoints come again beyond 48 hours or a last scan result X hours, basically ISE can ask these vulnerability management systems to scan the endpoint, updates it, so that for every 48 hours or X hours that you define, the ISE is going to submit the request to these vulnerability systems to assess the vulnerabilities of the endpoints coming onto the network. Now, those are the 4 cases that are available. I'm not sure whether any other 5th case available. Those are the 4 cases available with any endpoint coming onto the network. Now, you might be noticing I'm talking about a Cisco ISE and vulnerability management vendor integration now, and you might be noticing this condition, the last one. The TC-NAC service can be enabled only one single node in a deployment. No matter how many nodes that you have in the deployment, you can only enable TC-NAC service on the one single node. In that case, what happens if the endpoint is getting authenticated against the PSN where the TC-NAC service might not have been enabled? In that case, the PSN with which it got authenticated with has that endpoint information. That endpoint information is going to be sent to the PSN where the TC-NAC service is running. That is the PSN which is going to talk to the Rapid7, Tenable, and Qualys management systems to submit the scan request. And that submitted scan request, using that submitted scan request, it asks the local scanners to scan the endpoint. Once the scanned result is available, the result is going to be updated in the PSN with the TC-NAC service. It updates the endpoint with that information. And then PSN with which it got authenticated with takes the COA to give the dynamic authorization. That's how it works in the distributed deployment. Let's talk about the individual TC-NAC vendor, or the first one, the Tenable vulnerability management system integration with the Cisco ISE. Now, this is applicable. The slide is applicable not only for a Tenable, it's applicable for any vulnerability management system scanners. Basically, what they recommend is, if you have a different subnets or different locations in your enterprise network, you might have to actually deploy individual scanners in that respective location or different subnets. The reason? Your subnets or locations might have been segmented or might have been actually governed by the firewalls, and the firewall doesn't like these scanner pollings. So obviously, what they recommend is, instead of actually punching the holes to allow the necessary scanner traffic to scan the endpoint, what they recommend is, they want you to deploy the necessary scanner in each and every location or in each and every subnet possible, basically avoiding the firewall. All these necessary scanners, those are the local scanners. Consider that you have different locations or different subnets across the world. And all these scanners can be managed via one security console called the Tenable Security Center console. So you can basically manage, just like a Cisco ISE was managing, the PAN is managing the entire deployment. Even your Nessus scanners can be operated or can be managed via Tenable Security Center management. Now, you might be having, depending on the number of locations or based on the number of subnets, you might have to deploy the individual on-prem scanners. And all these on-prem scanners can actually managed via the Tenable Security Center. And in order to integrate with the Cisco ISE, you might have to actually exchange the certificate. So take the Tenable Security Center certificate and put that into the Cisco ISE Trusted Store so that Cisco ISE can talk to it securely. You might have to do it vice versa as well in order to have the secure communication between the Tenable Security Center and Cisco ISE. And you need to have a security manager account and not the global administrator account. And you might have to you need to define the repository and the scan zones in the Tenable Security Center for this integration to work. Once that is done, the way it works basically is the users and devices coming out of the network, they might get authenticated with a PSN. That PSN might or might not have the TC-NAC service. If that is not available, the TC-NAC service is not available with the PSN that it got authenticated with, the PSN is going to send it to the PSN where the TC-NAC service is running. Now that guy is going to actually send or submit the scan request to the Tenable Security Center, not to the Nessus. With what? Look at the scan policy, IP address, and MAC address. Those are the three attributes that we're going to actually submit to the Tenable Security Center. Using that information, Tenable Security Center is going to talk to the on-prem scanner, Nessus scanner, to scan the endpoint. So the Tenable Security Center manager can talk to the Nessus vulnerability scanner based on the IP subnet and the policy that you have defined. Now, once the scan is done, the Tenable Security Center is going to have the result. The PSN with a TC-NAC service is going to constantly poll the Tenable Security Center for the information availability for every 5 minutes by default. So for every 5 minutes, it's going to actually poll whether result is available, whether I've submitted the request earlier, does the result available or not. It's going to periodically check with the Tenable Security Center. So it's a polling mechanism to the Tenable Security Center. Once the result is available, it's going to update with base temporal CVSS score along with the plugin ID. The endpoint gets updated with this information, and the respective PSN to which it got authenticated with can take the COA, can do the COA, change of authorization, to give the deny or a restricted or a permit access based on the policies that you have defined. That's how it works. Now, let's look at the demonstration to get started with how do I enable the TC-NAC service. Basically, I'm logging into the Cisco ISE GUI console using the super administrator privileges. Let's look at the deployment. I'm having, for the demonstration purpose, I started with the standalone. And if you look at the PSN service, by default, the Threat-Centric NAC service is not enabled. Check that box, enable it. It's going to take a couple of moments in order for it to actually come up. Probably 2 to 3 minutes in my case. Just to let you know, how do I actually make sure the service is up and running? I'm switching over to the CLI of this ISE instance, and I'm trying to look at the services enabled and running on that system. Look at those 4 services highlighted. Those are the 4 services which are responsible for the TC-NAC service. Make sure they are up and running so that when you go to the Threat-Centric NAC service page, make sure they are up and running so that you can actually integrate these 5 different vendors. Of course, barring the CTA, you can integrate with ISE with any of these vulnerability or threat management systems. That's how you're going to enable the TC-NAC service. Let's see how the Cisco ISE and the Tenable integration works. I'm first of all logging into the Tenable Security Center using the global administrator. And let's look at the resources. Nessus scanner. There are two scanners that I configured in this. This is a Tenable Security Center management console wherein you have two scanners available. You can look at clearly what is the version of these two scanners. And I have defined the scan zones, which is an optional. The scan zones basically refers to what is the IP subnet range and what is the scanner that it got associated with. Now let's look at the organization. I've created one organization called a TME org. And to this organization, I've associated two repositories where the results are going to be stored, the Bangalore and San Jose. Let's look at those two repositories as well. These are the two repositories. What is exactly these repositories called? Repositories means basically you're defining the IP subnet and to which organization that you're going to be associating with. This IP subnet is, these repositories are basically is what you're going to be associating or configuring when you're integrating with the Cisco ISE. So this is how the organization to the repositories are mapped. If you look at the San Jose, have the San Jose endpoints in this IP subnet range, 10.10.10.0 subnet. Now let's look at the policies. For the demonstration purpose, I've created two policies. One is called a basic scan and another one is called advanced scan. The advanced scan is something like, apart from this, just a host discovery and a common port scanning, it's going to do the host discovery port scanning much more in which does the deeper analysis of the endpoint. You can make use of the default templates available to create the policies. And if you look at the basic scan refers to what are the common ports available, SSH, TCP ports available and all. That's what the basic scan does. So based on what exactly these policies that you are created, it's going to take its own time to assess the vulnerability. Let's integrate now. Let's go to the TC-NAC vendor. Let's select the Tenable Security Center. Let's give it a name called Tenable. Save it. By the by, all these vendor integration works in a Docker. So the moment you submit this, what it does behind the scenes is it's going to initialize the Docker container. The Docker container name is going to be the Tenable, the instance name that you have given. It's going to take its own time, probably a couple of moments in order for the Docker to come up. Once it is initialized and it is ready for the configuration, the status is going to show as ready to configure. That's when you can click on it. You can basically give the details. That's my Tenable Security Center Management Center IP address. I'm integrating over the 443 itself. I'm providing the admin credentials in order for it to integrate. Now let's look at the repositories. So remember, we have two repositories, Bangalore and San Jose. Currently, I'm making use of a Bangalore in which the endpoints are part of. And I wanted to make use of advanced scan to scan the endpoint with. Leave the default values as is. Click next. Click finish for the configuration. The moment you click finish, the connection status and the status is supposed to be shown as active and connected. Now this is where you're supposed to write the authorization policies. Before even we write the authorization policies, we need to actually write the authorization profile. Consider a scenario where the endpoint is coming into the network when the endpoint, when ISE doesn't have the vulnerabilities. So Tenable's _scan is the authorization profile that I wanted to enable or configure with the adapter instance. This is the second authorization profile called full network access. This authorization profile that I'm going to use when the endpoint has the vulnerabilities, but they are not significant ones. But I wanted to reassess them. So I enable the checkbox assess periodically above using the periodic interval. And I wanted to create one more authorization profile called for the endpoints having the vulnerabilities. So let's give it a name, restricted access. Again, I wanted to assess the vulnerabilities periodically. This authorization profile, I'm going to make it use of it when the endpoint has the vulnerabilities, but I wanted to reassess it again and again periodically. Just to let the endpoint know that the endpoint has the restricted access, I'm trying to actually redirect them to a block hole page. So I'm configuring two attribute value pairs. One is an ACL, another one is URL redirect. This URL redirect refers to the block hole page. Now that you have defined these three authorization profile, let's configure the policy set. I'm not making use of a default policy set. I'm going to make use of a new policy set. Let's create a new policy set called a Tenable policy set. And I wanted to, frankly speaking, whatever the endpoint comes onto the network, I wanted to match with this Tenable policy set. But however, I have the device types associated with a different classification or categories called wireless, wired, or a VPN. So when the endpoints are coming over the network via wired, wireless, or a VPN, I wanted to match with this policy set. So it doesn't matter whether they belong to, whether they are coming over wireless, wired, or a VPN. I wanted to match with this policy set. Let's go ahead and configure the authorization policies. Authentication policies, by default, it's going to be associated with all user ID in which Active Directory was also part of. So let's create one authorization profile on top of a default one for the new endpoints coming onto the network where ISE doesn't have the information of CVSS score. So basically, I wanted to, as long as it's part of an Active Directory so-and-so group, I wanted to use Qualys scan, Tenable scan, as an authorization profile in which you have enabled already Tenable instance. Now, the second policy is for the endpoints which are scanned already. ISE has the vulnerability information as well. So let's configure a condition threat as a dictionary. And I wanted to make use of a Tenable base score rather than the temporal score. As long as it is lesser than 5, I wanted to give full network access. But remember, this full access authorization profile has the assess vulnerabilities again and again enabled periodically. So the third one, the third policy is for the endpoint which has the CVSS score, high CVSS score. So as long as the CVSS score is greater than or equal to 5, I wanted to give the restricted access rather than giving the full network access. I wanted to give the restricted access. Instead of giving the trusted devices STT, I wanted to give the untrusted devices STT. Let's create one more. If it is beyond 9, that's where you remember the critical, the CVSS score is. So let's modify the condition. If it is greater than or equal to 9, then instead of giving restricted full network access, we will give straight away deny access. So let's go to the endpoint and let it get authenticated, enable the adapter, and make sure it got an IP address. Let's switch over to the ISE. Let's look at the live log. Look at the first two entries. Those the endpoint got authenticated using the .1x. And if you look at it clearly, because the endpoint is coming onto the network and ISE doesn't have the CVSS information, it matched with the Tenable scan authorization profile, where you haven't enabled periodic scanning, but you have selected scan with a Tenable. Now let's look at whether it submitted the result to the TC-NAC. if we go to the reports, there is a category called the Threat-Centric NAC report, and run the vulnerability assessment report. If you look at it clearly, it shows the MAC address and IP address. Using these IP address and MAC address, it submitted this request to the Tenable Security Center. Let's switch over to the Tenable Security Center and log in using the security administrator privileges. And let's look at the active scans or scan results available. By the time I switch over to the Tenable Security Center, it already ran this result. So it was almost done scanning the endpoint using the advanced scan policy that I have chosen during the integration itself. Once the scan result, once it scans, it gets completed. If you click on it, you will be able to find out the vulnerability information straight away from the Tenable Security Center itself. It found that one vulnerability called 57608, SMB signing not required, and it has the temporal and the base score. If you look at the base score, it's 5, and the CVSS temporal score, if you look at it, it's 3.7. That's the information actually gets it updated back to the ISE. As I said earlier, it's a polling mechanism. ISE is going to ask for every 5 minutes by default. I said leave the defaults, right? In the default, by default, it's going to check for every 5 minutes polling. Wait for few minutes. I just fast forwarded the recording. So now, for every 5 minutes, it's going to basically check whether the result is available or not. Now, once after 5 minutes, we have successfully completed the scan result, and it found the number of vulnerabilities found equal to 1. That means it completed the scanning and the result is available, and there is 1 vulnerability found on that endpoint. What is that severity? 5. And look at the timestamp. It actually records the timestamp at which it got information from. Because we got the information, irrespective of whether it is a 0 or a 1 or a 10, Cisco ISE initiates the COA. Now, once after COA is done, it is now getting matched with a restricted access. It was given with a restricted access authorization profile. You have the Threat-Centric NAC live log as you might not be making use of it so far. You might be making use of a Radius live log so far, right? But Threat-Centric NAC live log is also available for this purpose. And there is a COA. And if you look at the reason also, because it detected the threat and vulnerability of the endpoint, it raised a COA. So now it got matched based on the CVSS score. It matched with the high CVSS endpoint authorization policy. We have given them the restricted access. Let's look at the context visibility vulnerability endpoint dashboard. And the endpoint got updated with this information. Look at it. Now it got a plugin ID, score, and from which source that is the information we got it. And if you look at that, the restricted access, the authorization profile that we have given to the endpoint as part of a COA, once after the COA is done, we wanted to reassess the vulnerabilities again and again. Let's look at the endpoint experience. Because we have given them the restricted access, whatever he is trying to access, he might get redirected. You might want to actually modify this block hole page, or you might probably ask him to redirect to a so-and-so your own page, or put him in the so-and-so VLAN so that it can actually quarantined by using your principles. Those are the remediation methods. But however, I'm making use of a URL redirect in order for it to redirect to this page. This page can be enhanced, asking the end user what is supposed to be taken in order to come out of this situation. That's how this ISE and the Tenable integration works. Now let's look at the second TC-NAC vendor, Qualys. let's jump on to the second TC-NAC vendor, Qualys. Like I said earlier, even Qualys, it has the management system called the Qualys Enterprise. And you might have to actually deploy the local on-prem scanner. All these scanners can be managed via the Qualys Enterprise console, which is there in the cloud. So it's basically, in order to integrate a Qualys Enterprise Management with a Cisco ISE, you need to make sure the certificates are imported in your Cisco ISE. And you're supposed to actually configure the host assets and enable CVSS scoring in order to have the integration work. We're going to do the demonstration anyway. Now, I'm going to make use of this slide again and again, but if you look at closely, the fourth one, the scan request, the scanner and IP address and MAC address. So we were basically sending not only the IP address and MAC address, now the scanner information is also actually being sent to the Qualys Enterprise Cloud as part of your scan request. Using that scanner, IP address, and MAC address, the Qualys Enterprise Cloud is going to ask the on-prem scanner to scan the endpoint, get back the result to the Qualys Enterprise Cloud, and based on the polling mechanism, the PSN with the TC-NAC service updates the endpoint with temporal-based CVSS score along with a QID. QID means a Qualys identifier. Basically, every CVSS score that the Qualys has scanned with, it's going to be associated with what exactly the Qualys ID is. So all this information is going to get updated in the ISE. And as part of your policy, the PSN that it got authenticated with, it will raise a COA to give the deny, restricted, or a permit access. It's again the same thing, but the difference between the ISE Qualys integration and ISE Tenable integration, this is where a little difference comes into play. During the configuration anyway, I'm going to actually demonstrate it. You have the configuration available in order to map what is the PSN that you're supposed to map with a local scanner with, on-prem scanner with. Basically, the endpoints, based on the different locations and subnets, they can get authenticated against a specific PSNs, right? So you have the configuration available in the ISE during the integration itself. You can map individual PSNs to the on-prem scanner. But however, they cannot talk directly. The PSN1 cannot talk to the on-prem scanner directly. They have to talk to the PSN with a TC-NAC service enabled. And the PSN with the TC-NAC service is going to talk to the Qualys Enterprise Management Systems, not to the on-prem scanner directly. So that's where when the PSN with the TC-NAC service is submitting the scan request, it also actually has the scanner with which actually it has to scan with. Now, using that information, Qualys Enterprise Management is going to talk to the respective on-prem scanner to scan the endpoint with. If at all, you have the default option also available. In case if you don't have those many scanners, you can make use of a default scanner to scan the endpoint. This is a configuration change between Cisco ISE and Qualys, Cisco ISE and the Tenable integration. And let's look at in the action itself. Now, I'm going to actually log in. I logged into the Qualys Enterprise Cloud platform itself. Navigate to the scans, and let's look at the appliances that I configured. I have the 4 appliances in which 2 appliances were already up and running, and I'm making use of a second scan appliance for me to scan the endpoints with. These are the IP subnets that I have configured, and basically my IP subnet, the endpoints, they belong to 192.168.105.1, and I've created an asset group called my assets, and I have defined the IPs, the IP subnet range in which the endpoints are belonging to. So that's the configuration that we need to have, and let's look at the Threat-Centric NAC vendor. Let's go to the Threat-Centric NAC page. Select the vendor Qualys. Give it a name called Qualys. As I said earlier, the moment you submit any vendor instance, it's going to take a little bit time for it to actually come up, because internally it was making use of a Docker container. So the Docker container, wait for the Docker container to come up. And when it shows the status as ready to configure, that's when you can actually configure the Qualys adapter. Click on ready to configure. That's the API host I was making use of. Based on the Qualys Enterprise Cloud, your API might vary. And these are the username and password. Because my ISE cannot talk to the cloud directly, I'm making use of the proxy in order to talk to that cloud. So that's the proxy information in order to actually get to that cloud. Look at this default scanner. So you're making use of what scanner that you wanted to scan the endpoints with. Because I have only one single standalone, if you have multiple PSNs, you can map the PSNs with the different scanners as well. And then leave the defaults as is. Click next and finish the configuration. Then the moment you click on finish configuration, the connection is going to show as connected, but the status is going to be showing with an info icon. What is it doing? Cisco ISE was trying to import the knowledge base from Qualys to the ISE. What is that knowledge base? Knowledge base is basically the Qualys IDs, etc. So it's going to take a little bit time for it to get it updated with all that knowledge base. Once you have the status updated without info icon, that means ISE has already downloaded all the information. So in order to actually reduce the demo, so I created another policy set on top of the Tenable one. It's basically the endpoints whenever they come over the network via wired wireless VPN, they're going to match with this policy set. And the policies, if you look at it, they are almost similar to what I have written for TC-NAC. But instead of making use of a Tenable CVSS base core, I was making use of a Qualys CVSS base core to give the authorization to the endpoints. So when the endpoints match with the CVSS base core less than 5, I wanted to give the full network access. If it is greater than or 5, then I wanted to give the Qualys restricted access, deny access, so on and so forth. I made one correction over there. So let's look at what exactly those Qualys authorization profiles are. If you search by the Qualys scan authorization profile, this is the authorization profile I was making use to scan the endpoint when ISE doesn't have the information of the CVSS core. Because I have two adapters now running, I'm making use of a Qualys itself to scan the endpoint. If you look at the Qualys restricted access, I wanted to reassess the vulnerabilities again and again for every 48 hours. I've enabled that box. Qualys full access. Along with that, of course, you can actually put them into different VLAN, give them different privileges, etc. In the full network access also, I wanted to reassess the policies. I don't want to go by the one-time result. So I wanted to reassess the vulnerability information again and again. So this is the endpoint I was making use of to get it authenticated. It got connected already. And if I switch over to the ISE, let's look at the live log, Radius live log. The first two entries talks about this new endpoint. Let's remove all those earlier entries, failed entries. And if you look at that scan endpoint, the Qualys scan, that's the authorization profile that it got matched with. So Cisco ISE has the IP address information as well. And if you look at the authorization policy details, we haven't enabled the periodic scan, but we have selected the Qualys to scan the endpoint with. So let's go to the reports, vulnerability assessment report. And let's filter out based on the Qualys adapter instance name itself, because we have the Tenable and Qualys running. Just to filter out based on the Qualys instance name, and look at it. It was already submitted the result, and it was queuing the result. Now, if you come back to the this one, Qualys Enterprise, go to the scans, look at it, it's already running. So it already submitted the result to the Qualys Enterprise, and it asked Qualys Enterprise on-prem scanner to scan the endpoint with. It's already running. So wait for a couple of minutes. It's going to take its own time based on the policies that you have defined, how deeply you wanted to assess the vulnerabilities. Once the scan result is available, let's look at the summary. It finished the result. It took just over 5 minutes to run the scan. And if we look at the result, interestingly, this endpoint doesn't have any CVSS information. So the severity score, if you look at it, the CVSS is 0. But however, it found that 18 information gathered for the endpoint during the scan itself. It found that it is a Windows platform, endpoint mapper, SMB is enabled, so on and so forth. So it has the vulnerability information got updated, and the same when the ISE polls for every 5 minutes. Now it got the result back stating that VA completed successfully, but there is no vulnerability found. Even though there is no vulnerability found, that's an event basically. So Cisco ISE is gonna raise a COA in order to give the different access. So that CVSS score is 0, temporal score is also 0, and we issued the COA as well. The COA is successful on the same endpoint. Now it matched with a full access ODZ profile. Let's look at in the live log. So there is a COA without a username and password. That's a username. That's a COA, dynamic authorization. Why? The reason behind that is TC-NAC Service is initiating that and it matched with a full access and scan endpoint. Okay. And as part of the authorization profile also, we have enabled periodic scanning using the same adapter instance, and that means Qualys. So we don't want to just go by this one-time CVSS score. We wanted to reassess the vulnerabilities again and again periodically. So for every 48 hours, by default, that's the available one. So for every 48 hours, I wanted to actually scan the vulnerabilities again and again. That's the so when the same endpoint comes into the network within 48 hours, the ISE is not going to submit these requested to the Qualys to scan the endpoint. It's going to honor whatever the scan result available. If the endpoint comes back again beyond 48 hours into the network, that's when the ISE is going to submit the request to the Qualys Enterprise to scan the endpoint. So that if you do it again and again, 48 hours again and again, that's where the periodic one. Let's look at the third one, the Rapid7 TC-NAC vendor integration. Just like Tenable and Qualys, there is no difference basically. It submits the request to the Rapid7, that's the manager, which manages the Nexpose on-prem scanner to scan the endpoints with. Nexpose is the one which scans the endpoint, and if the result is once the result is available, it's going to get updated to the Rapid7 manager, and it updates the base and temporal information. So it works in the same, the policies, how you wrote the Qualys, how you wrote the Tenable, it's going to be one and the same. So I'm not going to do any demonstration for this Cisco ISE and the Rapid7. Forget, pardon me, the heading. It's not a Tenable, it's a Rapid7 integration. I'm not going to do any demonstration. Let's go to the fourth vendor, Cisco Secure Endpoint integration. Now, what exactly Cisco Secure Endpoint is? Secure Endpoint gives you. Cisco Secure Endpoint is an agent running on the endpoint. You can install it and it is going to run on the endpoint itself. Unlike the vulnerability management systems, of course, they are also agent-based vulnerability management systems available. But Cisco Secure Endpoint is going to be running on the endpoint itself to detect any threat, vulnerability, maliciousness, IOC, compromises, so on and so forth. It's real time. As and when the incident occurs, that's when the endpoint is going to get updated with. So the Cisco Secure Endpoint can basically real time, it can detect the ransomware, it can scan the files, it can do the behavioral changes, it can detect the behavioral changes using the machine learning and malware grouping. It can do the analysis of the files or the behavior of the endpoint. It can also actually do the file activity uploads or uploads and process, network, command line injections, IOC, compromise attacks, so on and so forth. All this, you're basically getting detected using the Cisco Secure Endpoint. How it works, the Talos and the Meteor is going to update the Cisco Secure Endpoint Cloud with the latest information. Cisco Secure Endpoint Cloud, through which you're going to actually deploy the Cisco Secure Endpoint to the endpoints. So when it is running on the endpoint console, that vulnerability instance is going to get updated with the latest and greatest information. And that vulnerability, if at all vulnerability is found, it's going to be there in the 30 days for your SOC team to do the analysis around it. And that's how basically the ecosystem works. Your secure endpoint cloud is going to get it updated with the latest Talos information. And thereby, we were updating each and every endpoint running with the Cisco Secure Endpoint. So that whenever you try to access any malicious site or you try to download any malware files, the information is automatically gets updated and it can detect the vulnerabilities or threats or maliciousness around it. So because it is a real time, it's we call it as rapid threat containment. As and when you get detected with the incident, the threat incident might be a painful, damage, catastrophic, etc. And we can take the course of action. We can write the policies in ISE to give the authorization to the endpoint. The way it works, you can deploy your Cisco Secure Endpoint to the endpoints either individually. You can just install Cisco Secure Endpoint on the endpoint itself, or you can actually combine with Cisco Secure Client also. You remember Cisco Secure Client or any Connect is a modular way. Along with a VPN and a posture model, you can also actually combine this Cisco Secure Endpoint with. So if the user, based on your requirements, you can basically deploy just a Cisco Secure Endpoint, or you can combine it with a Cisco Secure Client as well. Look at how this Jim, Harry, and Ellie is coming onto the network with having the Cisco Secure Endpoint installed onto them. When they come over wireless wired or a VPN, we might have given them the full network access privileges. Considering we have given them full network privileges, unknowingly, probably the Jim PC might have got affected with a threat incident. And that incident is going to be reported back to the endpoint cloud then and thereby straight away. And that information is going to be sent to the ISC straight away. What is that information is going to be? What is the threat detected? What is the source from which you got the threat information? And what is the threat severity and a course of action? Based on this, you can write the policies. If at all it is painful, the course of action, probably you can see it as a monitoring, and you can basically give the quarantine access to Jim. If at all it is painful, if at all it is damaging or a catastrophic, probably you might have to give the deny access once after the CYA. So based on the course of action and the threat severity, you can write the policies to give the differentiated access to the end users. Now let's look at in the action. This is my ISC, and let's log into it and let's see how the integration works. I'm logging into the Cisco ISE GUI using the super administrator privileges. Let's go to the Threat-Centric NAC vendors page and let's add the vendor instance. So this time I'm going to select AMP. Of course, the name has to be changed, and let's give it a name, that instance name as a Cisco Secure. Click Save. As I said earlier, it's going to take its own time for it to actually come up, the Docker container to come up. So in order to communicate to that cloud instance, I need a proxy. I'm making use of this SOX proxy, and you can make use of any one of these 3 cloud instances. Once you have selected a US cloud, I have selected US cloud. It's going to show you the authorization to authorize the Cisco ISC to grab the events from that cloud instance. Basically, it will take you to the cloud instance. I logged in already. That's the reason it didn't ask me for username and password. Otherwise, you might have to log into the Cisco Secure Endpoint console. I've selected the group protect, and I got the connected access. So I've already deployed the Cisco Secure client on the endpoint itself. The reason for not actually showing the Cisco Secure Endpoint deployment and Cisco Secure X, how it works, that itself is going to be a big topic and big one webinar it's going to take. That's the reason why I've already deployed Cisco Secure client in the endpoint, which has the Cisco Secure Endpoint module already installed. Just for the demonstration purpose, I'm trying to navigate to EICAR, ACRE. This is an organization, European Institute of for Computer Antivirus Research organization, which helps the vulnerability management systems, whether they are properly working or not. So if you download these files, they are considered to be malicious. If at all your vulnerability management systems are able to detect them as vulnerabilities or threats, that's good. Your systems are working correctly. So if you look at them, I downloaded, but somehow it was actually file missing. Why? Let's look at it. If you go to the event history, it will take us to the Microsoft event history console. So under Cisco, you have the Cisco Secure Endpoint. And if you look at it, the malicious activity detected. So you're trying to download a file, we detected and quarantined. So Cisco Secure Endpoint detected it and quarantined then and there itself. So all this information is happening at the real time. So if we switch over to the Cisco Secure Endpoint, you could see there are 2 computers. Along with this, I was playing with another computer also. These are the 2 computers, and let's look at the events. If you look at the events, it gets updated straight away to the Cisco Secure Endpoint about the events that you have you're trying to download so-and-so acre files, which is considered to be malicious. Good. So the threat, the same information is going to get updated to ISE. If you go to the context visibility endpoints, compromised endpoints dashboard, you can clearly see there are these 2 endpoints already has the threat or incident updated. So if you look at one of the endpoint here, if you go to the threat, you can see that the threat severity is painful. and confidence level is high, it was reported by the AMP. This is an incident. And if you look at the other endpoint also, basically it's the same one and the same. Both the endpoints are actually, I cloned them because that's the reason why you're going to see the same kind of incident on the same endpoints. So that's how basically based on this threat severity, you can write the policies to give the authorization to the endpoint. Of course, severity is painful. You might have to actually do a COA and probably take a course of action to incident monitoring and give restricted access, or probably put them into a VLAN, understand how it was behaving, and then probably ask or help those users to come out of the situation or fix that problem. That's how the integration works, Cisco ISE and the Cisco Secure Endpoint integration works. For those people who wanted to actually migrate a Cisco ISE to the latest and greatest versions of a 3.x version, because of so many challenges, or because of so many hurdles, or because of your perpetual base licenses, there are some people who are waiting for their upgrades to happen. So, the essentials are subscription-based licenses. If you're moving to 3.x, if you are converting your base to essentials with a minimum 3 year, out of 3 years, 1 year is gonna be free of cost. Not only that, if you wanted to actually upgrade these essentials or your base licenses to the advantage or a premium one with a minimum of 3 years, then you're gonna get 1.5 years or 1.5 years free. That's the offer we were offering to our existing customers. For more information, you might be having a lot of questions around this slide, I know. This go to that cs.co/ISE-licensing page to understand more details. If it is not updated, wait for a few more days to get it updated. This is the new information. Now, with that, I'm gonna leave with any outstanding questions. Rigo, do we have any outstanding questions that I could answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Pavan. So I do see that we do have one outstanding question from one of our audience members. And the question is, how much network load does an endpoint scan produce? Do I have to think about network performance when every client is scanned at the same time?
Yeah, this is not an ISA question, to be honest with it. So if you remember correctly, forget about a Cisco ISA or your NAC. I wanted to actually scan the endpoints using the Tenable, Qualys, or there are so many vulnerability management systems available to scan the endpoint with. Basically, this is the question that is supposed to be asked. And if you look at the policies in each and every vendor, it's simply based on the scan policy that you're going to write on these vendors. How deeply you wanted to scan the endpoint with. And they would recommend you to deploy on-prem scanners, the local scanners or on-prem scanners. They're going to change on-prem scanners and local scanners, one and the same. I'm going to change the wordings intermittently. Basically, these on-prem and the local scanners are supposed to be part of your one subnet, where you don't have a firewall which was blocking your traffic. If at all it was actually over the firewall, probably you might have to actually punch the holes in order for the local scanner to scan the endpoint. Now, coming back to the Cisco ISE, basically what are we doing? We were spinning up a container, one Docker instance, and we were actually we were posting the scan request to these vulnerability management systems to scan the endpoint. And we were polling for every 5 minutes to get the result. It's basically, there's not much load if you enable the TC-NAC service on the PSN. it's basically the entire load is going to be taken up by your local scanner or an on-prem scanner. That's the reason why it is better it's recommended from those vulnerability management systems to deploy on-prem scanners for each location, for each subnet, as long as they are not blocked by the firewall. I know it's a long answer. I hope that answers this question.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Pavan. Sorry, go ahead.
Any other questions?
No, actually, that question and answer pretty much takes care of all of the remaining questions for today. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to leave you with the Cisco ISE resources, which are more. I know most of you guys are already making use of it, but for those people who doesn't know about it, these are the resources available. And thank you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Thanks for joining us today.